Hello, dear ambassador. Thank you for coming to our school and agreeing to this interview. Today, we will talk about literature and its role in culture and diplomacy. For a start, simple question. What was the last book you read?
Thank you for inviting me here to the Maardu Gymnasium. The last book I read was not a work of literature, but was a history book, and it was called On Tyranny by US historian Timothy Snyder.
Very interesting. You have been working in different countries, studied various cultures, and as we understood, you have an interest in Russian literature. Could you please tell us which books have left the greatest impression on you and why?
I like reading different types of books, and my favorite actually is history more than literature. And so I would mention a different book by Timothy Snyder called Bloodlands, which is a history of the early 20th century of the countries, the lands between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, where so many people died. And that has been a topic of my diplomatic work as well, serving in countries like Ukraine, in Poland, and now Estonia. I also do love literature. When I studied Russian history and literature at university, my favorite authors were Dostoevsky and Chekhov. Um, I should also say I enjoy reading books that are not serious literature, but are more popular fiction. This year, for instance, I read the series by Frank Herbert, the Dune series. He wrote 6 books. There have now been several recent Hollywood movies. And I always like comparing when there's a TV or movie based on a book to read the original book. And usually I like the books better.
What do you do at first? You read books or watch films?
It depends. For Dune, I saw the movie first and I read the books after. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was in school, and then the movies came out later. For Game of Thrones, I think I saw the first couple of episodes of season 1 on TV, but then I read the books before the rest of the series. And I think in all 3 cases, the books are better.
Okay, yes, that's good. And it's interesting to me to consider how working in such diverse countries might have influenced your perception of literature. Have you discovered new dimensions in familiar works depending on the country where you were posted?
I definitely have, and I think I can again go back to Russian literature. When I first read Nikolai Gogol at Harvard University, he was presented to the students as a Russian author. He wasn't a Russian author. He was a Ukrainian who wrote in Russian. And when I was in Ukraine and I visited the towns around Mirgorod, where he was born and grew up, Nezhin, where he went to school, and understood who he was, a provincial Ukrainian who then went to the Imperial Russian capital of St. Petersburg, I understood that his perspective on life and writing was different than what I had been initially taught. Another example is after the Russian occupation of Crimea, I went back and read the poetry of Pushkin. It turns out Pushkin was a imperialist when he was writing 200 years ago. Lermontov, as a poet, was more sympathetic to the peoples that were being incorporated, attacked by the Russian Empire, particularly in the Caucasus. When I first read the 2 poets, I liked Lermontov better than Pushkin. And then 30 years later, when I reread it, I liked Lermontov's approach better than Pushkin, not as a writer, but as a person who was a Russian involved in wars of conquest.
Yes, I agree with you. And the last book that I have read was Lermontov's. Its name was Our Times Hero.
Yeah.
Yes. And next question is When Barack Obama visited Estonia, he quoted Estonian poetess Mary Under. And in your opinion, which has a stronger impact on people, poetry or prose?
I think it depends on the culture. Some cultures, poetry speaks to the soul of the country. And I know when I was learning Russian at university, we had to recite poems because I think in the Russian language, poets have a higher standing than novelists. Americans who study Russian literature actually prefer the prose writers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, over poets. And in general, in the United States, um, our most famous writers are writers of prose, not poetry. So I think it depends on the culture and the context.
And which form resonates with you more?
I prefer prose. I like reading novels, and I would say, in a way, plays are something in between because plays oftentimes are written as a form of poetry, but they are presented live and on stage. So I would say that's a third category. And I would say, arguably, the most famous writer in English ever, William Shakespeare, wrote primarily plays, neither poetry nor prose.
Okay. In Estonia, American authors like Stephen King, Mark Twain, Jack London, and Dan Brown are quite well known. Which works of American literature would you recommend to young people in Estonia?
Well, I think that question also gets into what is approachable, understandable, easy for young people to read, because some literature is really written for younger people, and others talk about themes that really are about later stages in life. So if I think of the authors who tell stories, American authors, that are approachable to young Americans, I can think those might be also easier for young Estonians to read. Uh, you mentioned Jack London. I loved reading Call of the Wild and White Fang as when I was in school, and I saw in your library that you have translations of those books. I think Mark Twain's story, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, to my mind, is really the greatest American novel. And it has a main character, Huckleberry Finn, who himself is a young boy who goes on this great adventure. But the language can be, I think, somewhat difficult, particularly the dialogue between Huckleberry Finn and the slave who's escaping, because it's how people spoke almost 200 years ago. Another novel I think that is a very good story to read in clean English is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. So I think that one tells the story of race relations in the South, about justice, injustice, and having empathy towards other people. So I think now, these days, many people cite that as the top novel, American novel to read.
Okay, I will try to read it too. Um, we have recently finished reading Jeremy David Salinger's novel, The Catcher in the Rye. This book seems to hold significant meaning for Americans and has become something of a cultural icon. What is your view on this novel?
Well, first of all, I have to confess, I didn't read it in school. I wasn't asked to. And so I only looked at it when my children were going through school and they had to read it. So I agree with you that it has become a very standard classic that is read in high school. I have to say it's not my favorite piece of fiction. I think it captures the atmosphere of New York City and of a certain social class in the 1940s and 50s. The language it uses is sort of the language of people in New York of that time. And a lot of US writers live and write in New York. And so I think that is why it was an influential novel. But I don't like Holden Caulfield as a character. He is so self-focused. It's all about him. And he whines and he complains. And I don't know if he really grows as a person or a character throughout the story. Maybe I'm being unfair. But I think as a book, it is more dated in the mid-20th century. And I think other novels, also about young people, have more timeless themes. For instance, To Kill a Mockingbird, or, as I said, an older book, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn.
Okay. And speaking of shared values, American literature and cinema often reflect commitments on themes like family and individual freedom. In your opinion, what other values are important to Americans and how they represented in literature?
Well, I think individualism, freedom, is a theme throughout U.S. history. And so I think when you look at different pieces of American fiction, you can find that theme throughout time. One great author in the early days, so writing even before Mark Twain did, is James Fenimore Cooper. And he created a character, the name was Natty Bumppo, in a series of books collectively known as the Leatherstocking Tales. The one that most Americans read is The Last of the Mohicans. And I think what was different was the main character came out of the English colonizing culture, but grew up with a Native American tribe. He was neither English nor Native American. He was American. And I think that idea of somebody on the frontier in between cultures helps tell the story of early America. And I think that's why the stories were popular and why that character, Natty Bumppo, is seen as a classic American literary character. Another great work of U.S. Fiction, literary fiction, more difficult to read, is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And the captain of the ship is the one who's trying to find this whale, this sperm whale. Moby Dick is the whale. And I think that is a great work of literature. It captures the obsession, single-minded focus and purpose that can achieve something, but it can also destroy the person. And I think that is why that is seen as one of the greatest works of American literature, but it's difficult to read.
Okay, maybe there is some translation that I can read too.
Yeah. I think what oftentimes people do, because in between the story, Melville writes all the details about whale hunting. And he describes equipment that is never used anymore because we don't hunt whales. So there is the technique of whale hunting, and then there's the story of Ahab and the whale. So if you skip the parts about whaling and just stick to the story, it's easier to read.
Okay, thank you for advice. Are there any works, whether books, films, or art, that hold particular significance for you personally?
Yeah. The film festival we've been talking about books, so maybe this way I'll answer about film and art. The Black Nights Film Festival in Tallinn, PUF, or whatever it is about to start. And one of the movies they're showing a lot of Georgian movies this year. And so there was a movie, its title in Russian Pakayanya and English Repentance. I saw that when I studied in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, in the summer of 1987. It was an amazing, powerful film by a Georgian director. It had to be made 3 times. The first time the KGB took the film away. The second time they filmed it a second time, the main actor then hijacked a plane, so they couldn't show it. So it had to be filmed 3 times, and it was about an authoritarian leader, Stalin, but they didn't call him Stalin. and when he died, what happened with some of the people who were pushing back against what he had done as a dictator. And it was satire, it was talking about the relations between people and government. And for me, as a student, university student in the Soviet Union for the first time, it spoke not just of Stalin or the Soviet Union, but of the nature of power and the individual. So that is a film that I will always remember, a very powerful film. Art has many forms. Rather than painting, which are considered the biggest, most accomplished part of art, I like textiles because for me, textiles embody culture, and it can be folk culture, but it also can be incredible beauty. And there are symbols that are in textiles that oftentimes are thousands of years old. So if I had a choice between looking at oil paintings and textiles, I personally would choose textiles. And everywhere I go in countries, I try to get at least one very nice textile as a way of remembering that society and culture.
That's good. Which of them have influenced you the most and helped you better understand other cultures?
In terms of film, textiles, and books?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think, cultures have different ways of expressing themselves. And so, for instance, every time I go to a different country, I do try to read books of history about countries. So, Uzbekistan, Poland, Thailand, Ukraine, now Estonia. And I also do try to find some textile that captures, for me, the artistic spirit of the country. Literature is sometimes more difficult to do because it has to be translated into English, usually, for me to read it. But for instance, I loved the most recent Estonian novel I read in translation in English, Jaan Kross's The Tsar's Madman. Have you read that in Russian
No,
or
no.
the Estonian? It's a pretty good book. I can recommend it. And I think it is, even though he wrote it in the 20th century, it's set in the early 1800s. And I think his novel shows more about society and life in the Russian Empire than, say, Turgenev or Tolstoy. And I think it's because he's not Russian. So he's writing as an Estonian about a nobleman who's loyal to the Tsar, ethnically Baltic German, marries an ethnic Estonian. The estate is here in Estonia. And it's actually much more sophisticated. And also, Gross and his main character are outsiders. They're in the system, they're in the Russian Empire, but they also have a perspective that is removed. And so it's sort of like Gogol as a Ukrainian going to Petersburg, and his understanding of human nature is very profound. And so I think sometimes the best authors have to be partially an outsider for them really to understand what they're writing about. And so, again, I really appreciate writers like Jaan Kross or Mykola Gogol, Nikolai Gogol, who write from that perspective.
Have you read Nikolai Gogol's literature in a regional language?
I have read short stories, and again, when I was serving in Ukraine, the early Gogol was not about St. Petersburg, but was about Mirgorod, the nights around Dikanka. And so I read his short stories when I was in Ukraine in Russian. When I read Dead Souls, Mrtvые Души, I read that in English at university. I did not try to read the entire novel in Russian.
It very helps to learning languages too.
Yeah.
In your view, what role does literature play in fostering mutual understanding between countries?
Yeah. I think what literature can do is it can give insights, deep insights into the culture. And so I think reading literature, whether it's prose or plays or poetry, can help people from another culture understand how authors have tried to show their own culture. Um, Sometimes that's what I would call a deep understanding, because if we take Russian literature, much of what is considered the great Russian literature is about the Russia of the 1800s, and now it's the year 2024. So, can anything in Russian literature explain why Russians are killing Ukrainians in Ukraine now? I don't think so. And so that's where I like reading both history and literature, because they oftentimes play off of each other. But literature is also what one author wants to show. Who's his audience? Is he writing for his countrymen? Is he writing for the outsiders? Is he writing for his own time? Or is he writing for the future? So I think we can appreciate the author's work, but understand the context, what it's written. Understanding another culture 200 years later, I think you need more sources than just art.
I think that soon Ukrainian authors will write about this conflict, and we will read it.
There are also some very good Ukrainian authors that maybe people will look to read them. One actually writes in Russian primarily. His name is Andrei Kurkov. And he wrote, I think, the first good piece of literature about this war. It's called Gray Bees. I'm a beekeeper, and so I appreciated the sort of metaphor of the bees. So that's a case of a novel written in Russian about Russia's war in Ukraine by a Russian-speaking Ukrainian author. And there are also some very good poets. I think Ukraine's leading poet is named Sergei Zhadan. He's from Kharkiv, which is a mainly Russian-speaking city, but he has chosen, even if Russian was his first language, he has chosen to write his poetry in Ukrainian. So if people were to ask, oh, what are some Ukrainian authors we haven't heard of that are worth reading? Andrei Kurkov, Sergei Zhadan are world-class authors.
Okay. Are there any authors who, in your opinion, help international readers understand American culture?
Hmm. That's so understanding American culture, then the question is, are we talking about popular culture? And oftentimes literature is not connected to popular culture. So on the pop culture side, I would say no. On the broader culture, or maybe even social dynamics, I do think there are a lot of authors. I mean, the US is a huge country. Estonia, 1.4 million people. America, 335 million Americans. And our history and the diversity in America is so broad that no one story can cover anything. One set of issues, for instance, is the American West. And there's lots of romanticism about the American West, cowboys. You know, you have a whole series of Hollywood movies about cowboy movies. But there are also some very interesting authors who write about the West. One who's a late 20th century novelist is called Larry McMurtry. Maybe his best known book is called Lonesome Dove. And so those are set in that period of time in the West. Something very easy for young readers to read is a series called Little House on the Prairie. It was written in the 1800s about a family that went and settled in Kansas in the 1870s, which is the experience of my family. So I read those books when I was in school, and they were written by a school teacher about her family's experience, but in language that was approachable for young people. So again, you have a contemporary talking about the cowboy culture, and then an older writer who wrote stories that are easy for young readers to read. And then, you can have the experience of Black African Americans. We have some amazing high literature authors, including a Nobel Prize winner. You've got Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and then earlier Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright. And so those are four Black authors who write and explain the perspective of life of African Americans in the US. And so, again, We have a huge country. We have lots of people, lots of different experiences, and some amazing authors who write about them.
It's as good as literature can show dynamics. Could you name a book that everyone should have read regardless of their cultural background?
Yeah. The world is so big. Now we're not talking about 1.4 million Estonians or 335 million Americans. We're talking about billions of people and different cultures and the like. So I honestly don't think one book everybody has to read. But if you want my recommendation, I think as a piece of literature that has themes that speak to the dangers of how governments and societies organize, I would pick George Orwell's 1984 because he wrote that in 1948, flip the dates. But this idea of what happens when power corrupts and then you have a nightmare world and how individuals can live within that. We all want everyone to have the chance to live in peace and prosperity and choose their way of life. But in many cultures and many times, you have people who don't care about the rights of others. They want to be in charge. And so if I had to pick one piece of literature, well written, that has themes that speak to the past and speak to the present and speak to the future, I would probably choose George Orwell, 1984.
Thank you. What do you think about reading nowadays? According to life experience, what would you say that young people tend to read less in today's society?
I'm not an academic expert, so I'm sure someone has tried to measure it. What I would say is that as I go from country to country, I think it's pretty clear that young people in every country spend way too much time on mobile devices. I would say the biggest danger actually is not that they're not reading, because sometimes people can read information on their mobile phones as well, but they're not outside and they're not moving. And you look at young people in countries all over the world, and there are a lot of fat young people. I don't really see it here in Estonia as much as in the United States, but Estonian health experts tell me that it's now over 25% of young Estonians, I'm not sure which ages, are overweight. And I think it's because too many kids in the United States, in Estonia, in Thailand, where I have served, instead of getting outside and playing with other kids, they're inside, sitting on a couch, on their device, and they're not moving. And that's going to lead to health problems for their entire life, and that will be very costly for societies. So, of course, I think everybody should read. How people read is different. I've stopped buying physical books in general and try to download it on my Kindle, just because I keep moving around the world. How many books physically do I have? And I've adjusted to reading books electronically on a Kindle. I resisted for 10 years. I said, nope, I want a book. And my wife convinced me that it wasn't too bad. So how people read is different now. And I probably do read more than my kids. My son reads a lot on Reddit. He had to explain the whole concept of Reddit. Okay, fine. He likes Reddit. I let him. He's reading, but it's not books. My daughters don't read as much, but they are following the news. So that's not on a newspaper, they're online. So that's why I say you can be online and still reading, but it's a different type of reading.
Yes, I agree with you. And finally, is there any author or work you would recommend to young people today, to all people, not only for Estonia? And in your opinion, how can books help young people better understand themselves and find their place in the world?
Yeah. I think, I probably can't answer that question. You asked me an earlier question, a book for everybody, and I gave you 1984. Yeah. For young people in Estonia, that's sort of a more specific context. I think the most important thing is to develop a love for reading and keep reading. And then it's not my recommendations or specifics, other than the ones I have mentioned, but that people keep searching out what interests them and they keep reading.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your answers and for sharing your insights and with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking that series of very stimulating questions. And I would say this is the most unusual or different interview I have had in 2 years in Estonia. And I really enjoyed answering questions about literature and art and not just about politics.
Yes, it was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.